On August 21, 1842, a slave named Charles swam across the Mississippi River and made his way to Quincy. Soaking wet, no doubt confused and lost, Charles approached a free black man who lived in Quincy named Berryman Barnett. The free man took Charles to the house of Dr. Richard Eells. They knocked on the back door, and after a quick check to see that they were not being followed, Charles let the slave in, still wet, to his house. Dr. Eells gave Charles a dry set of clothes and hurried him to his buggy. Together they drove for the Mission Institute, and the waiting helped to be found there across town. Unfortunately for Charles and Dr. Eells, Henry Durkee, the brother of Charles's owner, Chauncey Durkee, was in Quincy looking for Charles. He had an idea that Charles might make his way to the Mission Institute, where Dr. Eells, a physician, served as a professor. Together with local law enforcement and men from both Illinois and Missouri, Durkee was watching the roads going east from Quincy. As Eells drove to the east, his carriage was spied by the men near what is today Madison Park. Charles leaped out and fled into a cornfield. An intense manhunt took place. Charles eluded his captors for a short time, but eventually he was captured. Dr. Eells was able to get away from the pursuing posse and return to his house, but he had been recognized. The posse went to his house. They forced their way into his residence, and after a quick search, they found the evidence they needed to arrest Eells. Charles' wet clothes were still in the house where he had changed earlier. Eells was brought before a Quincy magistrate and charged with secreting a slave. After posting a $500 bond, he was released until his trial at the next session of the Adams County Court. That $500 bond would be the equivalent of nearly $15,000 today. It is easy to forget that Midwestern Missouri was a slave state born as a compromise between free and slave state power in 1821. In that compromise, Maine was broken off from Massachusetts and entered the Union free. In a curious twist of fate, Missouri was destined to be a peninsula of slavery thrust northward into free territory. No other state was to be admitted as a slave state north of the line 36 degrees 30 minutes north, the southern boundary of the state of Missouri. Missouri would always be surrounded on three sides by free territory. The slave economy prospered and grew in Missouri. By the time Dr. Eells arrived in Quincy, nearly 1 in 4 people in the Missouri counties just across the river were held as slaves. Slaves would have been a common sight in Quincy. Slaveholders from Missouri brought slaves with them to shop. Slaves worked on the riverboats that ran on the Mississippi. Immigrants on their way to Missouri passed through Illinois with their slaves in tow. Illinois, on the other hand, was part of the old Northwest Territory. The Northwest Ordinance that created the territory dictated that it was to be free states. A resident could not legally own slaves in those states. Illinois was to be populated by free mechanics and farmers. It was a recipe for conflict as the abolition movement grew. Dr. Eells and his wife, Jane Bester Eells, came to Quincy from Connecticut in 1833. Quincy was a thriving community of less than 2,000 people. Dr. Eells established a medical practice here. He and Jane had 2 daughters, but as was all too common in the 19th century, death was always nearby. By 1834, both of the Eells children had died. Perhaps to fill this gap in their lives and cope with their grief, they turned to the new abolition movement that was sweeping the nation. Abolitionism existed before 1833, but with the founding of the American Anti-Slavery Society that year by William Lloyd Garrison, it found new life. The new organization began flooding the nation with radical abolitionist tracts and newspapers. This was a new type of movement. The abolitionists attacked not only slavery, but the morality of slaveholders and the culture of slavery itself. In slave states, this movement was directed toward personal morality and saving the individual from damnation. But in the North, revivals frequently focused on institutional reform. Converts thought society could be perfected when everyone was filled with the Holy Spirit. From these revivals came prison reform, public school, and temperance movements. Northern revivalists hoped that by removing insufferable social conditions, sinners could be brought to God. In the fervent throes of these movements, the anti-slavery cause found a place to grow. Revivalists like Theodore Weld and Albert Barnes began preaching against slavery. If slavery could be abolished, they argued, master and slave could be brought to God. This religious abolitionism caught fire, and churches became bases for rapid expansion. Dr. Eells, along with Henry Snow, organized the Adams County Anti-Slavery Society in 1835. The constitution of the new organization set forth their goal. Whereas we, the undersigned citizens of Adams County in the state of Illinois, feeling deeply impressed with the sense of the awful sin of slavery as sanctioned by the laws and unblushingly practiced by many in these United States, and feeling conscious as we do that it is in direct violation of the laws of God and of the first principles of our Republican institutions, that the continuance of it is highly dangerous to our civil and religious liberties, and that we cannot conscientiously discharge our duty to our God and to our fellow men without giving our public and united testimony against it. In 1836, a dramatic event occurred in nearby Marion County, Missouri. Dr. David Nelson, a Presbyterian minister who had been converted to abolitionism by Theodore Weld, was run out of the state when he was caught with 2 agents of the American Anti-Slavery Society and a trove of anti-slavery literature. David Nelson fled from Philadelphia, Missouri to Quincy. He brought with him the idea for a new school to be formed in Quincy to be called the Mission Institute. The idea was to train home missionaries to work in the United States and with Native Americans on the frontier to promote new radical ideas. Among these was abolitionism. Dr. Eells and Nelson became fast friends and worked together to create the new school. One of David Nelson's converts in Missouri was Elijah Lovejoy. He was an editor of a Presbyterian newspaper distributed in St. Louis. After he became an abolitionist, his newspaper began agitating against slavery. This did not sit well with the citizens of Missouri. His press was destroyed, and he was run out of Missouri as well. Lovejoy moved across the river into Alton, Illinois, where he continued publishing his paper. Pro-slavery men destroyed his press 3 more times. Then on November 7, 1837, in a final assault, Lovejoy was shot and killed. It was about this time that Dr. Eells, Dr. Nelson, and the students and staff at the Mission Institute began helping runaway slaves. However, we know little about their early activities. It does appear that Quincy abolitionists kept watch on the riverfront for runaway slaves to help, but the abolitionists became impatient over time. In the summer of 1841, 3 men, Thompson, Work, and Burr, from the Mission Institute, crossed into Missouri. There, near Taylor, they found slaves working unattended. They invited them to run away to freedom, telling them they would return on the weekend with boats to take them away. This turned into a catastrophe for the abolitionists. The slaves they approached did not trust them. They had no idea white people existed who opposed slavery, or that Canada had just abolished it a few years before. Slaveholders carefully kept this information from them. The men did know they had value. Talking among themselves, they decided that Thompson, Work, and Burr were slave thieves. Believing they were protecting themselves, they told their masters about the plan. When the abolitionists returned, they were caught, tried, and sentenced to 12 years in the Missouri Penitentiary. But one good thing came of the arrest of the abolitionists. While awaiting trial, a slave came to the window of the Marion County Jail and apologized to the three abolitionists. He told them the slaves who turned them in did not know about the abolitionist movement. Because of their sacrifice, word now had spread through slave communities throughout northeast Missouri. It was with this knowledge that Charles crossed the river to Quincy and, with the help of Berryman Barnett, made his way to Dr. Eells' house. Eells was arrested for secreting an escaped slave from his owner. He posted a $500 bond. The governor of Missouri, Thomas Reynolds, sought to have him extradited, but Illinois Governor Thomas Ford refused because of threats of violence against Dr. Eells. Eells was tried in front of Judge Stephen Douglas, a friend of Abraham Lincoln, who would go on to fame as a distinguished senator from Illinois and 1860 Democratic candidate for president. Dr. Eells was convicted and fined $400. He appealed his conviction, but left Quincy. He died on a riverboat in 1846. His appeal was continued beyond his death by the Anti-Slavery Society. Nevertheless, his conviction was affirmed by the Illinois Supreme Court. The case eventually reached the United States Supreme Court, where William H. Seward and Salmon P. Chase, prominent attorneys who would go on to serve in the Lincoln administration, defended Eells. Seward was Lincoln's Secretary of State and Chase was Secretary of the Treasury. But the two influential lawyers failed to sway the United States Supreme Court, which upheld Eells' conviction. Eells was finally pardoned by Governor Pat Quinn, but not until 2014. We welcome you today to the house of Dr. Richard and Jane Eells, an important monument to brave Americans who stood up to the wrong of slavery at great sacrifice to themselves. Charles, the runaway slave, was returned to his owner. No doubt he was severely punished. He has been lost to history. Berryman Barnett, a free African American living in Quincy, was lucky not to have been charged in the affair. Dr. and Mrs. Eells lost everything following the arrest and subsequent legal battle. This house has been restored to what it may have looked like on that 1842 day when Charles knocked at the back door seeking to escape the bonds of slavery.